I guess we're live. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Spring CC's first webinar. We're delighted to have you all joining us. So today we will go through how marketing spend is shifting, what it means for procurement and marketing teams, and how brands should think about capability moving forward. So we'll be delving into 4 key topics. The first one is, as it says on the tin, where is marketing spend moving? The second one will be, how can marketing and procurement work better together? The third one will be, what shifts in skills and talents are needed? And then finally, we'll finish on the future of marketing, procurement and delivery. So this webinar will last an hour. We'll have a 45-minute run through of insights and conversation with our wonderful panelists today. And then we will have 15 minutes at the end for questions. You will notice that you're able to ask any questions in the chat. So please feel free to put those in the chat as we go along, and we'll make sure we've got some time to answer all, or if not all, most of them towards the end. And without further ado, I'm going to let all the wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Tina.
Hello, thank you very much, Rory. Hello, everybody, and nice to be here on this sunny Thursday morning. Yeah, it's Thursday, isn't it? So I'm Tina Fegent, a marketing procurement consultant, one of the first to do marketing procurement many years ago now, and worked on both client and agency side. And now, as part of my legacy, launching, we've had 1 year of the Marketing Procurement Awards that I created alongside Jeff Cobb, and also launched an online training program called Marketing Procurement Mastery, because really look at my legacy and really get in the visibility and profile of marketing procurement way higher than it should be. We deserve to be a lot better. So thank you to the gang at Spring for asking me to be involved in the panel today.
And I'm Anne-Sophie. I'm so glad we have Tina, because I can tell you as a marketeer, it makes a huge difference to have someone in procurement who's specialized in marketing. So thank you for joining as well. I'm Anne-Sophie. I'm the head of digital and e-commerce for Reckitt on Durex and Vit. So I work on all global initiatives. Prior to that, I've been working for other companies like Coca-Cola, Philips, and Reckitt today. So I also have a perspective of working in markets, which I think, in today's conversation will be really relevant on how we create content, how we scale, and how it's produced from global and how it lands in markets. So I'm very excited about this discussion. Thanks for having me.
And finally, I'm Austen Donnellan. I'm head of growth at Spring CC, and we're a creative and production partner. And I guess my contribution to all of this is I help sort of author the Spendshift report, which we're going to touch on a little bit with the help of, well, quite a lot of people, but Tina has also contributed quite a lot to the sort of commentary and the direction of what the Spendshift report does, which is the only real sort of industry report now which looks at, from a particular marketing procurement perspective, how is spend moving? How is it shifting? What does that mean for marketing ecosystems, for supply relationships, and importantly as well, what marketing departments and procurement departments need to do moving forwards? So that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. So I guess you've just started the conversation about spend. You might as well want to continue it, Austen. I'll hand over to you to run us through a few insights on where it's moving.
Just to give you everyone a quick sort of minute on the Spendshift report. So this was produced, it's produced every year now, and it's always produced at the last quarter of the year. And we have in-depth interviews with 200 sort of marketing procurement professionals from across Europe. And essentially that allows us to start to create some real rich data on how the industry is changing. And we produce this report, which the download for which will be available if you haven't had it already as part of the follow-up from this. And we obviously find a number of key findings. There's just 6 here, and we're going to touch on a couple of these as we go through. But I think, Barry, if it makes sense, shall I just quickly start to move into how marketing spend is moving at the moment? So when we look at some of the key findings, which is going to drive this conversation for the next 45 minutes or so, it's really quite an interesting change that we've seen in the last 12 months. Obviously, it's a tracker report, so we get a good sense of how the numbers are moving from one year to next. But I guess the biggest data point that we can see is, if you can see that bar chart on the right-hand side in red, then there's been quite a big shift, 10% or more, to what we call tier 3, which is production. And there's been quite a significant drop in the spend allocated to what we call tier 1, which is essentially strategy and creative. And as you can see from that graph, bar chart, sorry, you can see that the difference now is that there's been a move towards more tier 3 production, and tiers 1 and 2, tier 2 being about sort of development, are sort of facing some of the biggest cuts. So that chart there, which you'll see in the report, just shows you the sort of where the significant changes have sort of occurred. And we're going to unpack this a little bit with Anne-Sophie and Tina in a second, but what we can certainly see from the data is that when we look at how the spend is changing and what are the factors influencing those changes, then when we look at tier 1, it's clear that the cost of agency fees and the need to change agencies has been a big driver in the reduction of spend in that tier. Tier 2, which is broadly carried on as it was year on year, it's the focus and the demands has been very much about adapting for new brands, services, and channels, which is a topic I'm sure everyone on this webinar is going to be familiar with, but we're going to talk about it a little bit. And I think when we look at tier 3, which has obviously had the biggest change, that's really been driven by the need to invest in not just people but resources, as there's been a big demand for more content, more campaigns, and feeding the content machine. And I think at that point, it's probably quite a good time to hand over to Anne-Sophie, who might talk a little bit more about how it's impacting from her perspective.
Thank you. Yes, very interesting data. I think as marketeers, we all go through our budgets are constantly under pressure. So we need to make sure we get really better value for the same budget, or even sometimes for lower budget. So that report is quite interesting. From my perspective, probably what we see is I wouldn't say that marketing spend is moving away from strategy or creativity. I think it's probably shifting where the volume of work sits. We now know that consumers interact with brands across so many different touch points, much more than ever before, for sure. Social commerce, social media, influencers, creators, retail media, local, and then, if you are in a global role like me, you also need to think about how this content is going to land in market. That would usually require transcreation. Plus, we know that individual platforms would have different requirements. So it seems like content is multiplying. So of course, from that perspective, there's much more investment going into production and execution. But I don't feel brands are creating more campaign. What they are probably doing is they are creating more assets, and the reason for that is that we as brands, beyond campaign, we want to be always on or always on present, as we call it internally, and of course that increases mechanically the number of assets or the production required, but that's also an opportunity for us, right? Because more than ever before, we can reach consumers in much more relevant ways at a moment that matters to them and at a much greater scale. But there's also a risk to this, right? We need to make sure we invest in the right strategic thinking upfront. And that's why I feel, whilst I agree with the data of the report, I wouldn't say that we are spending more on strategy and creative. I think because production has become such an important part of our ecosystem, we need to to probably put a bit more budget into it. But I'm a firm believer that, you know, investing upfront in your strategy is key, because if you get your strategy done really well upfront, then the execution will flow and you will get much less wastage later on in the process. So I really feel, you know, it's a balance between investing into a great strategy upfront with a really good idea, and that will allow us to have a much smoother production process that can scale across all markets. I also feel like it will create a much more consistent look and feel, or consistent point of view for our brand, if, you know, we put much more time, effort, budget into strategy upfront. And I think I have a good example here of the work we did with Spring, where, you know, we've been working with Spring on our SEO strategy for Durex, and we started from the data to build the strategy, which really helped us to ground the strategy into meaningful data and consumer insights. And from that strategy, we started to identify the content needed and create that content. So I think for me, that's the ideal flow, making sure we really spend quality time into strategy, so then we can accelerate when it comes to production. So I don't think it's shifting from strategy to production. I would say it's more we're shifting from, you know, campaigns to always on content. So I guess that's why strategy is so important from the beginning.
That makes sense. And Sophie, and from your perspective, Tina, are you seeing this spend or this shift happening as well from procurement point of view?
Yeah, and I think Anne-Sophie covered everything, you know, and then also we've got that from the Spring CC report as well. I think, you know, we know it, you know, it's a complex marketplace, you know, with 25,000 suppliers, at least in the UK, across 29 categories, across 50 channels. I think you've also got pressure on internal resource, both within the marketing environment and within people like, you know, yourself and agencies. You know, you look at the headlines in campaign, there was 2 opposing headlines yesterday. WPP's in a cut job and Publicis is recruited. But, you know, you are finding that. So I think, yeah, we all know it's people want more for less. But I think, as Anne-Sophie said, it's about following the volume of work. And you always need that big idea, but because you've got that complexity of the multi-channels, and I think you overlay that with, not easy to measure, but I think there is much more of a focus on investing work that works. And Magical Logic, which is 20 years old now, that if anyone sort of remembers it, but it's the first time that in the UK, the ISBA, IPA and SIPS, our trade body, worked together. And it was 20 years old in June, which we've got a webinar in September to reflect on what's changed in 20 years. Said you have to invest in work that works, and I think that is so complex these days. But I think one of your key findings, I think it was number 2, about AI and automation, how that is so important as well, and that is from a core infrastructure point of view. So I think for me, AI, automation, MarTech ecosystems lead to actually making sure that from a procurement point of view, because you have got this pressure on budget, multi-channel, multi-supplier market, is making sure we balance efficiency with effectiveness. And we covered that at a Marketing Procurement conference this year, where we had Lawrence Green, the head of the IPA, ex sort of plant with another agency CEO, who said, actually, do you find that, you know, procurement want efficiencies, and production, a tier 3 could often be in that, but you need to have the effectiveness, and that should work across all the tiers as we defined it in the report. And I think, you know, as Marketing Procurement, Jerry Priest did a book many years ago, I forget what, I've got it here, there's a book I always wished that I'd written, is Should We Be Called Marketing Investment Managers? And I do feel that that is procurement's role. I had a call with Philip Schuster, who was the winner of our Honorary Achievement Awards on Tuesday, about the webinar, and he feels very, very strongly that procurement's role should be in working with people at Anne-Sophie and our stakeholders across the 29 categories to make sure that we can shape investment that creates the best value. So whilst the marketing spend is moving, it's nothing different than when we had in the UK, show my age, three TV channels, you know, to now these 50 channels we've got. You know, it's moving at a pace, and that's why we love marketing procurement. That's why I don't buy tin cans or paper or anything, and why I've spent 35 years in marketing procurement, because it's a fantastic category. It is fast moving. And the other thing that Philip Schuster said, I totally agree, is curiosity. And I think, you know, marketing spend is moving, but a good marketing procurement person will have that curiosity. But I think I'm agreeing with Philip in that we need to encourage that to be those marketing investment managers. So how can we balance the investment more effectively for our stakeholders with the budgets they've got, and make sure that's across strategy, creativity, and the execution. So across tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So it works harder, because success will be coming from getting the right operating models that drive efficiency and effectiveness in our role as marketing investment managers. And thank you, Sarah, for saying that you like the marketing investment managers. That's Jerry Priest, ex-P&G 25 years ago. You had to give him the credit for that.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's nice to have fans in the chat, isn't it?
Yes.
So now we'll move on to the next section. So we've talked about the added layer of complexity, the added layer of needing more bespoke operational models. How can marketing and procurement work together to achieve that a bit better? And maybe Tina, you want to tee us off on this one?
Yeah, I think, as always, it's getting procurement involved as soon as possible. And I even say to agency friends, you know, in a pitch process, a tender process, and they're trying to avoid procurement, it's like, you know, really sort of involve procurement from the very start. And I think even more so now in today's marketplace and the role of AI, you know, I'm sure all my procurement colleagues that are watching this do get frustrated when a stakeholder comes in and said, well, I've just done this deal, it's only 50 grand or 100 grand, you know, can we do the deal? But I think, you know, it's getting, always, I've said this for years, if you've got an outside consultant come in, so an AT Kearney or PwC or whatever, and I've been there and done it when I was client side, is often they design a 7-step sourcing process for internal procurement that is generic, from buying the tin cans to buying design services. And if you look at that 7-step process, usually step 2 is find me a supplier. And often we forget about step 1, which is make versus buy. So I do think, you know, my ask is, you know, for any marketeers or any of your clients that are watching, is really be involved before the brief and not after it. The other one for me is share KPIs. You know, I think at the end of the day, going back to that magic and logic about investing in work that works, is you can't have, if procurement, and hopefully my procurement colleagues that are watching, some are maybe targeted on savings, but that's a bit old hat these days. I know there's people like Emma at Specsavers who aren't targeted on cost savings. So I think marketing is measured often on growth, speed, you know, brand impact, whereas we could be savings, contract compliance, etc. But actually, I think the best organisations that work together have a number of shared objectives. And my ex-client Crystal Fahey's now at Moonpig, I worked with them at Orange, he said that at a conference years ago, is because if you have those common goals, you can deliver better marketing, that better ROI, and that effectiveness as well. And I do think, again, we need to move away from who's the cheapest supplier to who has the capabilities to deliver the model and the capabilities that the business needs as well. So I think from procurement, it's shifting that conversation with stakeholders away from cost to capabilities. Because, for example, in your report, you know, increasing complexity across spend decisions, regulatory pressures, partner changes, resource changes, market dynamics, you've got to react like that. So I think a good partnership between marketing and procurement is one that has that flexibility. But obviously, one of the key things is always about stakeholder engagement as well. So that's the 3 things that I would cover.
Sense. Maybe Anne-Sophie, from your point of view, I guess some of it will be music to your ear already.
Love it. I love it. Thank you, Tina. I mean, and I would tend to say, like, procurement is no different than any function in a company. So, I mean, the way I work in general across function is, you know, working with cross-functional teams in partnerships, You mentioned, in the old days it was procurement against marketing, but it was also marketing against commercial, so marketing against, the rest of the world. I think we've moved on from working in silos across the company, and I think procurement should be fully integrated in what you do. So completely align, the earlier you involve procurement. But I would even say a step ahead of that, I think what's really important is to make sure procurement understands what our roles are, what we're trying to do, because marketing has evolved massively, and it's true for procurement, but it's true for legal. When I get an asset approved with the legal team, if they don't understand where it's going to sit in our ecosystem, how can they, approve something? So I think it's exactly the same with procurement. If we don't spend time to educate, the teams in terms of, what is our role, what we're trying to do, I think then you won't get a really good outcome of that partnership either. So I think that was one. I really like your point about KPIs. The CMO of InBev was saying like they were doubling down in terms of, the investment on creativity, and they won like many awards in Cannes again this year. So I think creativity is also a big growth driver for companies. But when it comes to, KPIs and joint KPIs in an organization between marketing and procurement, of course, it's easily said, that we want to have joint KPIs, but how do you measure the quality of, the creativity of partners we work with? How do we, value their partnerships, their collaboration? I mean, it's not always easy. And I think the reason we used to measure cost saving was because that's an easy one. It's black and white. So I think there's like many more also qualitative KPIs that we can include when working with partners. So yes, I'm aligned with what you're saying. I'm just looking at, I had a few notes as you speak. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say is I think measuring a service is not as easy as measuring, a product when you are in procurement. And I think this is why having people like Tina who are marketing procurement is so important, because then you can get a chance to fully, immerse in what we do and understand what we're trying to achieve. So completely aligned.
Perfect. And maybe Austen, if you've got a few data points from the report to share with us specifically on where procurement might have the most influence actually across different tiers.
Yeah, that was really interesting points there. And one of the ones you mentioned, Anne-Sophie, when you talked about, it's very black and white when it comes to costs. And you can see on this chart from the report around where procurement's influence is most strongest is, unsurprisingly, it's strongest in tier 3, which is production, because it's much more easier to define. You're often talking about for content, you think it's a fixed number of assets and channels and so on and so forth. I think one of the interesting findings this year, which we sort of didn't expect to some degree, was that whilst you look at the influence of procurement on spend in tier 3 being either very strong or significant influence being at more or less 100%, when you actually look at the other tiers, tier 1 strategy and creative and tier 2 sort of development, the track is showing a slight dip there. The procurement's influence in tier 1 and tier 2 is around about 25 and 36% respectively. And this plays back a little bit to some of the points you were making about making sure, it's probably easier for procurement to often understand some of the requirements for a tier 3 part of a project. But when it's more strategy or creative, then is that where the understanding and the training needs to come forward so that they can get a better they can see more clearly what it is that's being bought and what's being developed. Because I think that's where the tension probably still exists. I mean, we'll look to see later this year how those numbers are moving, but that was certainly a surprise for us that the influence of procurement on spend does drop quite a bit when you go from tier 3 to tier 2 and into tier 1. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I totally agree, Austen.
I don't know where the button is, so I'll I'll be analog, but I suspect the reason for this, Austen, is also because so much has changed in tier 3, to be honest. As a marketeer, this is really at the moment where I value, procurement expertise to help us make sense of, all these different partners, how different they are, how are we going to measure them? Whilst I feel, to be honest, tier 1 and tier 2 haven't changed so much yet. And the ecosystem in tier 3 is endless. So without the support of procurement, I feel like it's a bit challenging for us also as marketeers. So I think this is probably where the biggest change is happening at the moment. And that's probably what we see reflected in the data.
And I think from my point of view, Austen, I think having been at Cannes this year, but only one of maybe 10, 20 procurement people, and obviously, I've funded it myself, been a consultant, and I do worry about the lack of investment. It's hard, when you talk to our procurement friends, and we all got them in departments, that department of 10 has gone down to 5, and they have to prioritize and stuff like that. But, going out, things like events that we see each other at, agency events, Cannes, for example, the training course we've launched I think I'll just make a plea for procurement, just spend the time being curious, to use the answer that Philip Schuster and I were discussing the other day. And that worries me on that tier 1 and tier 2 stuff, because that's exactly where we can really influence. Because, tier 3, as you said, is probably more modular and stuff like that. But actually, being involved, like I said at the very start, before a brief, being involved in make versus buy, and we've got in-housing, haven't we? That was our, of key findings 6 from the report about it is a priority. But actually, potentially, if you look at the Specsavers, for example, and procurement's role in how they can manage in-housing. So I would say for procurement on the call is to really make the time to be curious and invest time. And hopefully even just today being on this webinar shows that you are, for example, if you've got CPD hours, our course is CPD, as well, deliberately to say you've got to invest the time to learn and actually, come out to Cannes. It's bloody hard work, but actually you get to see, you talk to Philip Schuster at Bayer, who they saw, who they connected with in those 3-4 days. So I think be curious, and I think that helps build the relationship. And that's why I think it gives you that confidence and that knowledge that you can work with the stakeholders on that tier 1 and tier 2. And so fingers crossed, Austen, that next year, hopefully that influence level will start to go back up on tier 1 and tier 2 as well. Because it does worry me a bit, I have to say.
Yeah.
I like that we're trying to build a dream team in the middle of a World Cup. It's quite topical. So now let's talk about the shift in skills and talent needed. We know that ecosystems are becoming more complex. Obviously, AI and automation is at the forefront and everything. What is that shift in terms of skills that are required now for the marketing of the future and the marketing procurement of the future? Maybe Anne-Sophie, you want to start on this one?
So, maybe that's going to be a bit controversial, but I don't really feel that the core requirements of marketing have changed as much as, you would think. I think, a really good marketeer need to understand, consumers, we need to understand brands, we need to understand how to drive growth. All of these things remain the same, I would say. What has changed dramatically, though, is the complexity of the ecosystem, as we discussed before. So probably we now need to play in a much larger ecosystem. So we need to make sure we can orchestrate that new environment where there's new technology, new data, new partners, loads and loads of content. So we need to make sure we can navigate, AI tools, new data platforms, new touch points, and so on. There were many named from the report. But the reality is, as marketeer, our core expertise is marketing, and we will never be able to be expert in everything, right? So we need, for each organization, I would say, make sure that we understand which capabilities, we want to build internally, and for which one we want to partner externally. And that's a choice. And that's a choice, procurement can also help us make, because there might be, some capabilities that are really expensive to buy, outside of the company, whilst, we can have them built internally. So I think bringing external partners is also a very, very good opportunity to upskill your internal team. So I think it's a win-win, and then we can develop further. And here I can speak for myself, because when I started to work on digital roles a few years ago, like I knew nothing about SEO, but working with partners, including you guys from Spring, I've built really a lot of knowledge. So I'm not the expert still, but I am an AI expert? Certainly not. But do I understand the implication? Yes. So it means, I can challenge, our key partners. I can ask the right questions. So I think for me, it's really making sure, as marketeers, we have the core skills, very important. We understand the ecosystem, really important as well. But it doesn't change, the core capabilities required. So AI will help us, to automate some tasks, to improve efficiency. But at the core of really good marketing, there will still be human judgment. And we see this a lot. There's been a lot of content, like there was a name for this, like cannot remember the name, but you read it now, like you read content, it's completely bland. And you can tell this was fully created by AI.
AI slop.
Working on a brand like Durex, I can tell you, I want consumers, when they read an article on Durex, they know it's written by Durex. It has this playfully provocative tone of voice that no one else can have. And that's what our consumers want. They want to connect with our brands. So yes, you can use AI, to create the base of your content, but you want to make sure it's being looked at through a human lens. So I think, I'm a big believer that, AI is great and it's inevitable to compete, but our human judgment is going to be our differentiator.
Couldn't agree more. And from your perspective, Tina, how is that shifting in the world of marketing procurement?
A couple of things. I think we do need to move away from being cost focused and negotiating RFPs and contracts. I think we do the good marketing procurement teams and the really established ones, including Reckitt, the Diageos, the banks, the FMCG that have marketing procurement teams in place. Bayer, for example, Beiersdorf, for two of our 6 awards this year it was really interesting in the awards, because we had a mix of judges, including agency CEOs and agency in the business. And they were actually really, really taken back and really interested in the breadth of knowledge that the people that submitted the entrance did, because they did show across the board, and we had tech ones and projects and team of the year, really showing marketing strategy and how they're involved in that, and working with stakeholders, that looking at agency models, looking across the different categories. So I think my view is that marketing procurement have to become, and are a lot of people are already more commercially and marketing literate, which gets to the point we have with Austen, in that you've got to know what you're buying. I mean, if you're buying a category and you're buying, I don't know, sugar, that is one category, and how often does that category change? And the reason we work in marketing is because we love it, and all of us, we bleed, marketing, but it is complicated and it is fast moving. So therefore you have to educate, you have to invest the time to educate, because I do think human skills in this world of AI are going to become more valuable. And we saw that at recent marketing procurement conference. There was quite a lot of topics. We know the agenda is often steered by the sponsors that are paid. And there was a lot of talk about AI and content and production. And whilst AI is automating the process, and I think there's been a question about the impact of AI, and I think we all know that's in the press every day. And when I do my Tina Tales on Friday, it's really hard not to include an AI automation article, because there are so many to put it in there. But obviously, we know that, and an AI has a great role to play in circumstances, but I do think technology won't, having the relationships with stakeholders and suppliers, influencing stakeholders, being involved in those business plans at the start of the year. There's a question about how can you trigger marketing initiatives. If you're that agent of change is another phrase I've used quite a lot as well. If you're sitting down, and I've seen this in the farmer side, for example, done really well, to sit down at the start of the year with the stakeholders and say, well, what's your plans? What do you want to look at? Where can I help? Are we looking for new categories? Are we looking for new suppliers? How can we work with you, and how can we help manage that change? And I think, procurement, the shifts in talent and skills in our is curiosity, to have the question, spend the time learning, have that curiosity to challenge, because I think, we have to keep pace with what's going on, and that the only way you can do that is by continuous improvement and keeping up to date with suppliers, the supplier system, the ecosystem, the different remuneration models. Is Cindy Rose right? Time materials dead? Cut to chase? No, it's not. But there are 16 other models we can look at. So I do think procurement teams that invest in capability and just try and get out of the office a bit more. I'm not saying go to Cannes, because it is, say, 4 or 5 days, but great to see more there. But there's so many, including, like today, and there's so many talks and conferences and just sitting with your stakeholder as well. So I think AI will not replace what we do, but I do think that human capital, that human knowledge, and that was a core theme that came out of the conference 6 weeks ago, is getting that balance. Again, getting back to my first point about AI can help drive efficiency and effectiveness, because it can on both, but you still, it would never replace the humans in terms of those relationships and those great ideas and working together to drive the best results for the budget. Because that's the end of the day what it is, that increasing pressure on budgets. You need to have the best results for that budget to make it work a lot harder. And it's great that we've got AI, automation, great ecosystems to help us now. We never had that 30 years ago. That sounds like a tour old fart in terms of how I started in marketing procurement with a requisition pad and Kelly's directory trying to look up suppliers and business cards.
I think one of the points you've made there is really interesting. In fact, both of you made them in slightly different ways. But I think Tina Tells last week, there was that comment about, we're talking now about skills and talent. And, what I think one of the dangers we can foresee is that some organizations, and that could be brand or agency.
ASOS, wasn't it? It was this guy ASOS, wasn't it? About that into 3 organizational capabilities. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the danger that, they're going to use AI more to reduce the need for maybe some more junior level staff, because they think that they can get some of those functions done at a junior level using AI tools. And that was my read on the article. But it's like that presents a danger then, because to our points about, that need for curiosity, that need for sort of human expertise, when we look at the next generation of whether it's marketing procurement or agencies, are we going to cut, we're going to harm ourselves because we could be stopping that next generation coming through. So I think that was one of the watch outs that I took in the last couple of weeks as well about that.
It's really interesting to see how no matter what the future holds, humans are always at the center of it, and emotional and intelligence as a whole is really the soft skill that everyone needs. It always comes down to that, no matter what happens. And I think it's quite refreshing to hear it when all you hear about across every social platform is AI. Actually, the marketing leaders all think actually is the human element is the most important. Right, let's move on to our final question, which is about the future of marketing, procurement and delivery. So Tina, what does the future look like for marketing procurement?
I think I'd go back to that investment in curiosity, I think, from that point of view. Because I think it's interesting is how much you invest in time and how much you learn, because, things like, I do think we're in a time of change. Say Cindy Rose's comment about time materials is, and my argument when I met her in Cannes was, there are 14, 16 other remuneration models. And I understand your argument about getting the right remuneration system in place that, drives effectiveness and efficiency. So I do think for the first time ever in my career, things are changing. I think for the better. because we are having those discussions. I think, you know, we are looking at, if you again look at what Bayer have done with their big global pitch last year and the commercial model, which was covered in the recent conference, really interesting how they reward success with that one global partner they've done across all categories, and they're quite open about how they've done it. So I do think the future is, in the last 12, 18 months, I think we're seeing more change in marketing procurement than we've seen in quite a long time. I do think, you know, things like agency rosters and preferred supplier list are being replaced with like ecosystems. And I do think that does lend itself, say, to what you're saying in your report. And that does cover things like finding too about AI and automation, how they're key, you know, just on a pitch recently, and, you know, did the chemistry. The next thing was, oh, can we have an AI automation, MarTech discussion? And that was a media thing. I do think you've got your key finding 5 about the partner ecosystems are expanding and not consolidating. You're seeing that on the acquisition side. You know, I caught up with an M&A friend last year, and I think last week, and that was really interesting about what's happening on the M&A side in terms of that. You just see it every day, don't you? On Public Supply and Live Ramp and stuff like that as well. And then also I love number 6, which is the in-housing, which I think is really interesting because, and especially says you got there for tier 3, is actually what is procurement's role in that. And I do think today we often haven't been involved in that. It sometimes is can be managed by an ops people or, you know, an ops team. So I do think, you know, for me, the future is really looking at your key finding 2, 5 and 6 as well, because I think we are looking at ecosystems. We are looking at the role of AI. So your point 2 there. And I think, you know, looking at point 6 and my point earlier about a sourcing process, step 1 versus make or buy, I think we are increasingly, and you saw that with the work that Philip and Marion did at Bayer, and also the team in the UK, the CCS tender structure they did last year. I think as marketing becomes more connected in terms of, you know, and pressure to deliver against multi-channel, is I think we're increasingly becoming architects of marketing delivery. And again, if you talk to the team at Bayer and how they constructed that process last year, you know, across global, you know, tough markets as well, Bayer, you know, a lot of pharmaceutical thing, but how, I mean, obviously Philip Schuster, you know, is ex-procurement now operations, but with Marion in procurement, how they were the architects of that marketing ecosystem that is now in place, and now they're making it work. So I think that the future is us as architects of marketing delivery. And I do think it is a time of change, be it on remuneration, marketing ecosystems, global supply chains. I do hope, one of my hopes for the future is that we start to focus a bit more back. It doesn't really cover in the report, ESG, diversity, because sadly, and especially for those of you that perhaps, if we're not this time of day and on in America, but we know how it's off the agenda. We know it's off the conference speaker circuit in the States because of the current, obviously, political climate. So that is my one positive wish, is we start to get, I mean, those of us in the UK that have been hit in this heat wave for the last 10 days, you know, I rest my case, you know, in terms of climate change. And sadly, it's come off the agenda too much. So I do hope for the future of marketing procurement, from a, you know, doing our bit, that we start to get those topics back on the equality as well, you know, quality, diversity and sustainability back on the agenda. And maybe, Austen, it's something we can maybe look at for next year, perhaps for the report, and maybe looking at something like that. So I don't think we covered it, did we, this year?
We've covered it a little bit, but even though there's core parts to the Spendshift report that are a tracker, so we will ask the same questions. We'll always change one questions each year, but I definitely agree that looking at ESG, DE&I and lean processes and all those things that were massive topics not that long ago, which just suddenly evaporated, we really should get a read on what the level of interest is like and what the ambitions are. I think that would be really
and the Spring CC point of view as well in terms of that, because obviously you guys are supporting a lot of that, and it's having education and working with clients on that to say, especially tier 3 stuff, probably even more so, isn't it, in terms of there is an impact of the stuff that we are doing.
Yeah, there's a huge energy demand for tier 3 production, so it's like, well, how's that been done? we've
Yeah, good
positioned
point.
that.
Good point.
It's like that's really important.
And Anne-Sophie, from the marketing perspective, what does the future hold?
I see many questions in the chat, so I'll try to be brief, so we can also answer some questions. But from the report, you know, you can see that, okay, tier 3 has expanded, you know, there's been a shift, but equally what the report is saying is it is to be expected that, you know, now we will enter a new phase of rationalization, consolidation. So that is also something that might happen where we need support from procurement. I think now we've done a lot of test and learn. We've tried working with different partners as part of our ecosystem. So how do we move to the next phase that, you know, we have probably more established partners that, you know, we've been working with. So I think that's where the savings are expected as well. Like that's what the report was quoting as well. So fewer production partners, and this is where, and that's the tier in which we expect, we as the report, the most savings. So I think that was interesting. The other thing I really liked, Tina, is what you said about internal, I would call it internal procurement, because I feel, you know, procurement is much more focused to support us in, you know, finding the right external partners. But I think that is a big change of perspective. How can we have procurement helping us building the right capabilities internally? I think is really interesting. And you can see how, you know, we could work with HR and IT and, you know, different function to create, you know, in-house capabilities that, you know, maybe we cannot find or externally, or we want to invest strategically internally. So I think that's a very interesting point. But from my perspective, I mean, when it comes to marketing, you know, and I said this before, I mean, AI is great, of course, you know, and as you said, Austen, it helps with really like repetitive tasks, anything that is production intensive, like or taking us a lot of time. So that's all great and it makes us competitive. But I really feel it's not going to replace our deep consumer understanding, you know, or strategic judgment, cultural relevance. Like
it's those nuances that is often where the brand really thrives, and that you can't get always from an AI.
Exactly, because if you think of cultural relevance, which again for a global brand like Durex is so important, you know, you're not going to reach out to a consumer in the same way in Indonesia or in the UK. So how do you make sure as a marketer you capture, you know, the right tone of voice is really, really important. So I think having that lens is, again, what is going to make your strategy and therefore your execution much more on brand. So I think that's you know, that's the balance we need to find. And this is really where, you know, we have a shared role with procurement. We need to make sure, okay, we are investing in the right technology. This is adding value, potentially saving costs. But we also need, as a team, to protect the capabilities that create genuinely a competitive advantage. And I think that would be, you know, human judgment, strategy, thinking, and so on.
And I think from the agency point of view, I mean, from the Spring CC point of view, we've got kind of 4 things that we're heavily focusing on, most of which you've already mentioned. The first one, obviously, AI and automation, more from the point of view of not putting all our eggs in one technology or one basket, but rather being continuously curious about what's coming up, so that you can provide the best solution for, so we can provide the best solutions for our partners rather than just the solution that we have. And I think that's incredibly important, to be agile in that way. Data, to your point, Anne-Sophie, I think not data for the sake of data, but data for the sake of understanding consumers better and really understanding their triggers, rather than have tons and tons of data that you don't really know what to do with. The other thing, and you both mention it, is very much hyper-personalization, interestingly enough, rather than having AI slop and all kinds of content for the sake of content, really having specific content silos and areas for very specific audiences. And I guess the last thing for us is having this ability to build bespoke operating models, because every company will be different, will have different needs. So for agencies to not have one mold and one way of working, but rather deeply understanding what the needs of procurement are versus the needs of marketing, which essentially are the same, and working to craft an operating model that really works for them, for us, is incredibly important at Spring. I'll leave this conversation there, and now we'll move on to the questions, because we've got a fair few people in the chat who are curious and want to know more.
Maybe start with Christina's at the last one that's come up. Barry, that was quite an interesting one. It wasn't, maybe that's definitely one that Tina and Sophie would find interesting.
Definitely. So let me read it out loud for those of you who might not have the chat open. What are your views on volume incentives, rebates, and what other ways can benefits be shared with a long-standing marketing agency supplier partners? Who would like to go first? Maybe Tina, from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Christina was agency side or client side or marketing side, because there's a bit of a contradiction in the question is, what is your view on because it was a procurement person saying, what's your view on volume incentive rebates, and what other ways can benefits be shared? Because I think if you're a supplier, a volume incentive wouldn't be a benefit. But if you're a procurement person, it is a benefit. So I'm not sure, where Christina's coming from in terms of. What do you think, Austen?
Selfridges, Christina's.
Yeah, I have never, ever, ever been a fan of volume incentive rebates, because they're just, I mean, you guys can talk from a supplier point of view, because it just gets put on the cost. There was just no added value to, and I've had a client recently who, it's the way their P&L was constructed. What there is no point. There is, because suppliers have to find that money somewhere. So for me, it's better off getting the best commercial deal. And again, it's not just about cost savings. So for example, in a media pitch I've just done, and I encourage the media agency to encourage an additional discount in place for other parts of their really well-known and lots of capabilities. And it's worked wonders already, because, that they've basically, the client's like, oh, that's quite interesting. I've got X% across PR, SEO, whatever, if I need. So I think, I don't like them. I've never liked them. I think they're very basic from a procurement point of view to do it. I don't recommend them. And I never see them these days. I never see them.
They are definitely rare. I mean, from an agency perspective, not the same as a volume incentive rebate, but the idea of having, different tiers and thresholds. So if the value or the volume of the work increases and hits certain tiers, then there's a benefit to the client from that. I absolutely am happy to sit down and negotiate that, because to the second part of Christina's question about the benefits, it's like, well, if we do good work and you're prepared, because you're a company with multiple brands and multiple markets and multiple needs, if you're prepared to trust us to take on more brands, more work, and that then increases the volume of work, then we're obviously happy to look at a better commercial deal once we start to hit those next thresholds as the year or however we structure it. But the key to it is really focusing on those KPIs at the start, whether it's with procurement or marketing procurement, and sitting down and saying, okay, how do we know this is going to be working, and being really specific about those KPIs and making them longer rather than shorter. That's
where it falls down, Austin, because marketings can't do the KPIs often.
And just very quickly, I think one good approach to this is making sure we have shared KPIs. So we discussed this about marketing and procurement having joint KPIs, but it goes in the same way of sharing these KPIs with partners. So we all know we're going in the same direction. And, you know, if we hit these KPIs, then, you know, we will be equally rewarded. So I think for me, it's being very transparent with our partners in terms of what we're trying to achieve and how can we achieve this together, rather than focusing. And I understand your point on value. I'm not denying it, but it's also, of course, about the value you get.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let's move on to the next question. So what are the practical ways that you can reduce costs without compromising quality? Who would like to go first on this one?
I can go first. For me, it's not specifically reducing your budget. It's more like within the same budget, how can you remove waste? So for me, that would be the biggest opportunity. We all see, you know, as marketers, we all see every day how we could, you know, remove waste from the work we do. And with that saving, how can you hopefully reinvest in marketing rather than making a saving? So I think that would be that would be my answer to this. So not necessarily reducing your budget or saving costs, but how can you remove wastage and reinvest to get more value out of it?
That makes sense. From our point of view, I mean, from a pure production perspective as well, it's this idea of process optimization. I mean, one of the things that we are good at Spring is reviewing constantly the way in which we do things, see where automation makes sense, see where it doesn't, where it's actually quicker and brings more efficiency to keep things manual, for instance. So it's this idea of, you know, being self-critical from our point of view and understanding how we can we do things better for you guys with the same amount of money. So it's, I think that the point of view is very similar on both ends of the spectrum. Maybe a question.
I would say, why do you want to reduce costs? Because surely it's maximising the budget. And again, you know, I don't know the person that's asked that and the role they're doing, but, you know, it shouldn't be about reducing costs. It should be about investing in great work with great suppliers that drives results. So what if here's a rebate because you spend 250 grand? It's like, you've got to have work that works, because, you know, at the end of the day, and again, in the conversation I had with Philip Schuster, that is our role. We are that enabler to work with the stakeholders to make sure they are doing that right work for Durex. At the end of the day, that drives sales. So for me, again, a really good marketing procurement team are being involved up front, as we've said, and actually saying, right, how can we, you know, what are the KPI? At the end of the day, let's face it, most companies is to drive sales. What can we do to help you maximize your marketing investment, whatever that is? And I do agree with you, Barry, internal processes, you know, about governance. That is, you know, physician heal thyself. And, you know, 30 sign-offs, you know, it's like, come on, you got 2 approvals round. So, and I think I've had that recently with a client, and I actually said to the senior client, you need to get your team act together, because if you're dealing with agencies the way you've dealt with me on this project, then it's not great. So I do think there's a bit of internal reflection. I'm being a bit tough this morning, but I just, you know, from marketing procurement voice, it's like, come on guys, move away from the cost. It's about marketing investment and how we can work with great people like Anne-Sophie to drive the best, and great suppliers like you to get the best value. And it's how you define value from that.
That makes sense. And maybe another question for you, Tina. How can procurement trigger marketing initiatives from your perspective?
Be involved from the very, like I said at the very start, be involved. Be, you know, one, invest in my training course. Sorry for the plug there, Marketing Procurement Mastery. Spend the money on, you know, learning yourself. You know, great, you had an hour today, you know, with us, which is great. Know your category. That's the end of the day. I think that's where the downfall of most marketing procurement people. And I quickly tell the story about, you know, years ago, as a girl who's buying the beans for Heinz. And if you're buying the beans for Heinz, baked beans, those of you in the UK, it's an important job. She then went to do digital services and just applied her baked bean buying process to that. So I think we can trigger marketing initiatives by again, investment in being involved at the start, knowing our knowledge, and the key thing is stakeholder engagement. And, you know, spend the time to educate and be curious, and it will then flow, because you will work with great clients. You've got to know your stuff. You cannot be buying baked beans and then go and, you know, managing 29 different categories and apply the same. You have to understand marketing is different, completely different from any other category, but you need to get yourself at that table with the marketing person, and then you'll trigger too many initiatives. You won't have time to manage them all. Prove yourself.
Makes sense.
Got 1 minute left.
1 minute, one last question. This is the moment I release the knowledge that I know nothing about beans and all about baguettes because I'm French. Last one is, what is the impact that AI is having on marketing spend irrespective of the tiers? Maybe one last one, Anne-Sophie and Tina.
Well, everything, isn't it? Automation of like content creation, production, workflow. It's all of that, isn't it? In terms of just move faster and scale more efficiently.
And I like your point also, Barry, about processes, because I think this is where there are like buckets of, wastage internally and externally for sure. So I think there are small things we're looking at, to really unlock these bottlenecks. So if you identify them, like how can we create the AI tools that, remove these bottlenecks. So I think that's probably the biggest opportunity. And it goes back to speed, efficiency, reduction of wastage, and then allowing marketeers to spend more time on the activities and tasks that will make more of a difference.
Makes complete sense. Well, I think we've reached the end of the hour, right on time, team. Thank you all so much for joining this webinar. Thank you, Tina, Anne-Sophie and Austen, for this great conversation and all your insights. You will be able to download the Spendshift report at your leisure. We'll be following up with some of the insights there you go. Tina's ready to show it to you. Fantastic, fantastic work there, Tina. Love it. And if you want a hard copy, we can also provide hard copies. But thanks again so much for attending today. And hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us. Bye, guys.
Okay then. Bye.